The gym echoed with the sound of basketballs bouncing and sneakers sliding across the polished floor. Coach Mercer Holbrook stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, carefully watching his players as they ran through drills. This was no ordinary practice. With only a week left before a crucial game, every second counted. For the North River Wolves, Mercer was more than just a coach, he was the reason for their consistent success. At 35, Mercer carried himself with confidence. His sharp eyes missed nothing, whether it was a player's footwork or a small gap in defense. His tall, athletic build and neatly pressed shirt with the university logo gave off an air of authority, but he wasn't unapproachable. The team respected him, and for good reason. Under his leadership, they had reached the finals 3 years in a row, and this season looked just as promising. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall gym windows, lighting up the court. Mercer, however, barely noticed. His mind was on the game plan and how to refine it. He knew what it took to win, not just skill, but discipline, strategy, and teamwork. That was his focus. But this season wasn't like the others. Something or someone was about to shake up his carefully planned world. What started as another promising year for the Wolves would soon lead Mercer into something far more personal and much more complicated. The gym was buzzing with energy after a big game. The North River Wolves had just secured another victory, and the stands were packed with cheering fans. Among the crowd, one face stood out: Astrid Payne. Her platinum blonde hair and piercing green eyes were hard to miss. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Mercer Holbrook's attention. She was different from the other fans, reacting passionately to every play and analyzing each move like she belonged on the sidelines. After the game, when most of the crowd had dispersed, Astrid approached Mercer. She held the game program in her hand, her movements calm but confident. She introduced herself as a freshman journalism student with a deep interest in sports. Mercer, who had grown used to casual conversations with fans, was struck by how well-informed she was. Astrid wasn't just asking surface-level questions, she wanted to know about the team's tactics and stats in a way that felt professional. Their conversation was brief, but it lingered in Mercer's mind long after. There was something about Astrid's energy, her curiosity, and enthusiasm for basketball that made her stand out. He brushed it off at first, telling himself it was just a polite interaction. But as the days went on, he noticed her more often. Astrid began attending practices, sitting quietly in the stands with a notebook in hand, jotting down observations. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, and she would give him a small, knowing smile. Mercer didn't quite know why he found himself thinking about her. But one thing was clear: Astrid Payne wasn't like anyone he had met before. This wasn't just a passing moment, it was the start of something he couldn't ignore. As the weeks passed, Mercer found himself growing more aware of Astrid's quiet presence. She became a familiar figure at practices, always in the same spot, taking detailed notes. While most students her age would have been content cheering from the stands, Astrid was different. Her focus wasn't just on the excitement of the game, but on the finer details, the plays, the teamwork, and the strategy that made the Wolves a strong team. Mercer began to admire her determination. It wasn't often that someone so young showed such maturity and passion. At first, their interactions were limited to brief nods or a few words exchanged in passing. But over time, their conversations grew longer. She would approach him with thoughtful questions about the team's performance, and Mercer, who rarely opened up to anyone outside the court, found himself enjoying the discussions. Astrid's curiosity seemed genuine, and her knowledge of the game surprised even Mercer. She wasn't just a fan, she understood basketball on a deeper level. Her insights were sharp, often leading Mercer to see things from a new perspective. Slowly but surely, their connection moved beyond the boundaries of coach and observer. Mercer tried to keep it professional, telling himself that she was just another student interested in the game. But something about her unwavering interest and the way she listened made their conversations feel different. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. They began talking about other things: books, life on campus, and even their personal goals. Without realizing it, Mercer had let Astrid into a part of his world that he usually kept closed off. It was clear to him now. Astrid wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was someone who had sparked a connection he hadn't felt in years, and it was becoming harder to ignore. Astrid Payne wasn't just a dedicated student, she came from a background that shaped her independent and focused personality. Her mother, Jenna Payne, had raised her alone after a tough divorce 4 years ago. Jenna worked long hours as a nurse at the city hospital, often pulling night shifts to make ends meet. Despite the challenges, she was fiercely proud of Astrid, who had always shown resilience and determination. Their bond was strong, built on trust and mutual respect. Jenna encouraged Astrid to chase her dreams, and Astrid never gave her mother a reason to worry. She excelled in her studies, balancing her coursework with her growing passion for journalism. To Jenna, Astrid was the perfect example of how perseverance could overcome any obstacle. But as Astrid spent more time at the gym, a slight distance began to grow between her and her mother. Jenna assumed it was just the natural shift as her daughter adjusted to college life. Astrid mentioned her interest in basketball and her plans to write for the university newspaper, which Jenna fully supported. After all, it seemed harmless, a motivated young woman pursuing her ambitions. Astrid's focus on her journalism major and her fascination with sports made her stand out on campus. While most freshmen were still figuring out their place, she was already making strides in a field she cared deeply about. Her relationship with her mother remained strong, but there were subtle changes. Jenna couldn't quite put her finger on, changes that hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. For Astrid, juggling her growing connection with Mercer and keeping her mother in the dark wasn't easy. Jenna's unwavering trust in her was something Astrid valued deeply, but it also made the weight of her secret even heavier. Little did they both know, this quiet family life was about to be upended in ways neither of them could have imagined. What began as casual conversations about basketball soon turned into something deeper. Astrid and Mercer started meeting outside the gym, first for a scheduled interview about the team's performance, then for longer, unscheduled talks. These meetings felt natural, even though both knew they were treading dangerous ground. Mercer told himself it was harmless, a coach helping a curious student, but the line between professional and personal was beginning to blur. Astrid, on the other hand, felt drawn to Mercer in a way she couldn't fully explain. She admired his dedication, his focus, and the way he carried himself with quiet authority. Their talks started to include personal stories, glimpses into their lives outside the court. Mercer shared memories of his challenging childhood, how basketball had been his escape, and the lessons it had taught him about resilience. Astrid, in turn, opened up about her dreams of becoming a sports journalist and the drive that had shaped her life. They began meeting in places away from campus, away from prying eyes. Coffee shops in quiet neighborhoods became their new gathering spots, where they could talk freely without interruptions. For Mercer, it was a break from the pressures of coaching and the constant scrutiny that came with his job. For Astrid, it was a chance to connect with someone who took her ambitions seriously. But even as their connection deepened, Mercer couldn't ignore the risks. He was a respected coach with a reputation to uphold, and Astrid was a student, barely starting her college life. He tried to convince himself that these meetings were just two people sharing a mutual interest, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. What neither of them realized at the time was how quickly their secret meetings would spiral into something far more complicated. The boundaries they had already crossed were only the beginning of a story that would soon take a darker turn. Mercer Holbrook's confident demeanor on the sidelines was only part of the story. Beneath his polished exterior lay a complicated past that had shaped him into the man he was. He rarely talked about his early years, but during his quiet moments with Astrid, he let pieces of his history slip through. Mercer grew up in a struggling neighborhood in Detroit, where opportunities were scarce and life was often unforgiving. His mother, who worked tirelessly to provide for him, passed away when he was just a teenager. Left with an alcoholic father who could barely care for himself, Mercer learned to survive on his own. Basketball became his lifeline, a way to escape the chaos at home and find purpose. That relentless drive to rise above his circumstances pushed him to excel, but it also left scars. Mercer was fiercely independent, often keeping others at a distance. He had learned the hard way that relying on people could lead to disappointment. Yet, this self-reliance also made him struggle with his emotions. He had a habit of bottling things up until they boiled over in unpredictable ways. Astrid began to notice these cracks in his otherwise calm and collected persona. At times, Mercer was kind and thoughtful, opening up about his struggles and how they had fueled his success. But there were moments when his mood shifted abruptly. He could become cold, detached, or even irritable over seemingly minor issues. Once, he slammed his car's steering wheel so hard in frustration that his knuckles bled a side of him that left Astrid unsettled. Despite these outbursts, Mercer remained a figure of strength and determination in her eyes. She attributed his occasional mood swings to the pressure of his job and the high expectations placed on him. What she didn't yet realize was how deeply those past wounds affected him, and how they would come to play a role in the choices he made. The cracks in Mercer's armor were beginning to show, and the foundation of their relationship was growing shakier with each passing day. As Astrid's connection with Mercer deepened, subtle changes in her behavior began to emerge. At first, they were small enough to go unnoticed: missed calls from her mother, shorter visits home, or vague explanations about where she spent her evenings. But over time, the shifts became harder to ignore. Jenna Payne, who had always prided herself on knowing her daughter well, started to sense that something was off. Astrid had always been dependable and open with her mother, but now she seemed distracted. She often came home late, claiming to have been studying at the library or working on a journalism project. Family dinners became less frequent, and when Jenna asked her questions, Astrid's answers were brief and evasive. For a mother as attentive as Jenna, these changes were impossible to overlook. One morning, while doing laundry, Jenna found a business card from an upscale restaurant tucked into Astrid's jacket pocket. It was the kind of place far removed from campus life or casual student outings. When she asked about it, Astrid quickly lied, saying she had gone there with friends to celebrate finishing a project. Jenna didn't push further, but the unease lingered. Astrid, meanwhile, was finding it increasingly difficult to balance her growing relationship with Mercer and the expectations at home. She loved her mother deeply and hated deceiving her, but she also feared that the truth would shatter the trust they had always shared. The weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day. Jenna's concerns were genuine but quiet. She told herself that Astrid was just going through a phase, adjusting to the independence of college life. But deep down, a mother's intuition told her there was more to the story. As Astrid continued to withdraw, Jenna could only watch and wonder what was pulling her daughter away. Little did she know, the answers would soon come to light in ways she couldn't have imagined. Astrid's busy college life began to slow down when her body started showing signs that something wasn't right. She felt constantly tired, struggled with nausea every morning, and experienced dizzy spells that made it hard to focus. At first, she thought it was just the stress of balancing studies and late nights, but as her symptoms persisted, she grew more concerned. One day, after missing her second monthly cycle, Astrid decided to buy a pregnancy test. She waited nervously in the quiet of her dorm bathroom, staring at the result as it appeared. Two unmistakable lines confirmed what she had feared: she was pregnant. Her hands shook as she tried to process the news, her mind racing with questions about what to do next. But that wasn't all. A routine visit to a private clinic revealed even more devastating news. Alongside the confirmation of her pregnancy, a blood test returned a shocking result: Astrid was HIV positive. Her world, already turned upside down, now felt like it had come crashing down entirely. She sat frozen in the doctor's office, replaying the words in her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. The reality of her diagnosis hit her like a tidal wave. She had always been careful and responsible, never taking risks or putting herself in harm's way. Her thoughts immediately turned to Mercer, the only person she had been with. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place: his refusal to use protection, the pills she had seen in his bathroom, and the moments he seemed unwell but brushed off as stress. Astrid left the clinic with more questions than answers, her emotions swinging between fear, anger, and heartbreak. She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother, knowing the pain it would cause. Instead, she decided she needed to confront Mercer directly. The situation was now far more serious than she ever imagined, and she knew she couldn't face it alone. Little did she know, this confrontation would mark the beginning of even darker days ahead. Astrid didn't waste much time after learning the truth. She decided the only way to move forward was to confront Mercer Holbrook face to face. She rehearsed the conversation in her mind repeatedly, trying to stay calm despite the anger and betrayal she felt. The man she had trusted, the man she had believed in, had kept a devastating secret from her, one that had now changed her life forever. When they finally met in a small, quiet cafe far from campus, Astrid wasted no time. She placed the clinic report on the table, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I'm pregnant," she said, watching his expression carefully. "And I'm HIV positive. From you." For a moment, Mercer didn't react. He stared at the papers, his face unreadable. Then, he leaned back, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "What do you expect me to do?" he asked, his tone cold. His response was a stark contrast to the caring and confident image he usually presented. "No one's going to believe a student over me. You'll only ruin yourself trying." Astrid felt a surge of anger rising inside her. She wasn't the naive girl Mercer thought she was. She had prepared for this. Pulling out her phone, she calmly told him she had evidence: messages, photos, and meeting notes that could prove everything. "You might have the power to scare others," she said, her voice firm, "but not me." Mercer's expression darkened. His charm and confidence melted away, replaced by an icy hostility she had never seen before. He accused her of trying to blackmail him, throwing insults as if they would somehow deflect the truth. But Astrid held her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. For the first time, she saw him for who he truly was: a man consumed by his need to control, even at the expense of others. The conversation ended with an uneasy agreement. Mercer promised to pay for medical expenses and offered money to keep her quiet, but Astrid wasn't sure she could trust him anymore. As she left the cafe, she realized she was no longer dealing with the Mercer she once admired. This was someone entirely different, a man who saw her as a threat instead of a person he cared about. The betrayal was complete, and the path forward seemed darker than ever. Just days after their tense meeting, news of Mercer Holbrook's death shocked the campus. His car was found submerged in the river near an old pier, a location far removed from his usual routines. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic accident. But as the details emerged, the situation became far less straightforward. The authorities were quick to cordon off the area, pulling Mercer's black SUV from the murky waters. His body was still inside, strapped in the driver's seat, but there were no immediate signs of foul play. Investigators found a mix of items in the car: a laptop, water-damaged papers, and a medical report that was almost illegible. Initial speculation ranged from a possible suicide to a simple driving mishap, but nothing seemed to add up. The campus was buzzing with rumors. Students whispered about the pressures Mercer had faced as a coach, while others floated wild theories about hidden personal struggles. Some couldn't believe that a man as composed and successful as Mercer would take his own life, especially with his team on the brink of another championship. What caught the investigators' attention, however, was the absence of skid marks leading into the water. It was as if the car had driven straight off the pier without hesitation. This raised questions that demanded answers. Who was Mercer meeting that night? What was he doing so far from campus? And most importantly, why had he ended up in the river? For Astrid, the news came as a mix of shock and unease. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. While she wanted to believe it was unrelated to their recent confrontation, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. Mercer's death was just the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel secrets far bigger than she had imagined. Detectives Raven Thorne and Kyle Everett were assigned to the case, stepping into what initially seemed like a routine investigation. Thorne, a seasoned detective with 2 decades of experience, had a sharp intuition that often led her to uncover details others overlooked. Everett, her younger partner, balanced her instinct with a meticulous eye for evidence. Together, they made a formidable team. The first hours of their investigation were spent at the scene. The old pier where Mercer's car was found was isolated, with no nearby witnesses and only a single set of fresh tire tracks. The lack of visible struggle or evidence of foul play complicated things, but Thorne wasn't convinced it was a simple accident. "Something doesn't sit right about this," she muttered as she examined the scene. Their next step was to retrace Mercer's last known movements. Security footage from a nearby cafe showed him meeting a young woman late in the evening, but the video was too grainy to confirm her identity. Witnesses were scarce, though one cafe worker vaguely remembered seeing a blonde student leave shortly after Mercer. The detectives noted this detail and moved on to the evidence recovered from the car. The laptop found in Mercer's SUV was sent to the lab for data recovery, and the water-damaged papers were painstakingly dried to extract any useful information. Among them was a partially legible medical document, which hinted at a recent health issue but left more questions than answers. Thorne and Everett flagged it for further investigation, suspecting it might connect to Mercer's sudden death. Their early interviews painted a picture of a man under pressure. Colleagues described Mercer as increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to his death. His assistant coach noted that Mercer frequently checked his phone during practices, a habit that seemed out of character. These small details hinted at something personal weighing heavily on him, but no one seemed to know exactly what. As they pieced together the timeline, the detectives realized they were dealing with more than a simple accident or suicide. The fragments of Mercer's life suggested hidden complexities, and the mystery surrounding his final hours only deepened. Thorne and Everett knew this case would demand their full attention and tea. As detectives Thorne and Everett delved deeper into the case, their investigation took an unexpected turn. A key lead came from the toxicology report, which revealed traces of a powerful sedative in Mercer Holbrook's blood. The dosage was far beyond therapeutic levels enough to incapacitate him completely. This finding shifted their focus from an accidental death to a likely murder. The detectives began reviewing hospital records to trace the source of the drug, which was not something easily obtained. Their search led them to Jenna Payne, a senior nurse in the infectious disease ward of the city hospital. Jenna's spotless reputation and decades of experience made her an unlikely suspect, but the pieces of evidence pointed in her direction. Notably, records showed that a vial of the same sedative had gone missing from her department weeks before Mercy's death. When questioned, Jenna appeared calm, even cooperative. She explained her routine and insisted she had no connection to Mercer Holbrook. But inconsistencies began to surface. On the night of Mercer's death, Jenna had arrived late for her shift, citing car trouble as the reason. A fellow nurse recalled seeing her enter the hospital soaking wet, even though it had barely started raining at the time. Small details like these began to chip away at her alibi. Further digging revealed a critical piece of the puzzle. Jenna had accessed her hospital's medical database shortly before Mercer's diagnosis was made public. This raised a troubling question: had she discovered his condition and taken matters into her own hands? The detectives couldn't ignore the possibility of a motive tied to her daughter, Astrid. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Jenna's composure faltered briefly. Thorne noticed the tension in her voice and the way her hands clenched slightly as she answered their questions. Still, she stuck to her story, denying any involvement. But the detectives weren't convinced. They knew they were closing in on the truth, and that Jenna's protective instincts as a mother might have driven her to do the unthinkable. As the evidence mounted, the detectives realized they were unraveling a story far more personal and emotional than they had initially anticipated. Jenna Payne's role in Mercy's death was becoming clearer, but proving it beyond doubt would require one final, undeniable piece of evidence. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives Thorne and Everett presented Jenna Payne with the final piece of evidence: a microscopic trace of hospital-grade antiseptic found on the steering wheel of Mercer Holbrook's car. It was a brand used exclusively in her ward, and while it seemed insignificant, it was the thread that tied her directly to the crime scene. Faced with this, Jenna's carefully maintained composure began to crumble. Sitting in her modest living room, Jenna looked out the window as Thorne laid out the case against her. The room was silent except for the detective's calm but pointed explanation of the evidence. Finally, Jenna took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with resignation. "I knew you'd figure it out," she said quietly. "You wouldn't have come this far if you didn't already know." Jenna admitted to following Mercer on the night of his death. She had overheard Astrid talking about their meeting at the cafe and had pieced together the devastating reality of what Mercer had done to her daughter. "I saw him sitting in his car," she began, her tone colder now, completely unaware of the damage he'd caused. She described injecting Mercer with the sedative, her training as a nurse allowing her to administer it flawlessly. "He didn't even have time to react," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't plan it. I just couldn't let him get away with it." Jenna explained how she drove Mercer's car to the pier, steering it into the water while ensuring there would be no signs of struggle. "I knew it had to look like an accident," she continued. Not for me, but for Astrid. She didn't need more pain. When asked why she hadn't tried harder to cover her tracks, Jenna's response was simple. Because I wasn't running from this. I knew the moment I did it that I'd face the consequences. But I wasn't going to let him ruin her life any more than he already had. Her confession was raw and emotional, filled with both guilt and defiance. She admitted to crossing a line but justified her actions as a mother protecting her child. If that makes me a criminal, so be it, she said, her voice breaking slightly. But I don't regret it. Not for a second. As Jenna finished, there was a profound silence in the room. Thorne and Everett exchanged a glance, understanding the complexity of what they had just heard. This wasn't a crime driven by malice or greed, but by a mother's desperate love for her daughter. The case, though solved, left them grappling with the blurred lines between justice and morality. Jenna Payne had spoken her truth, and now it was time for the law to decide her fate. Jenna Payne's confession marked the end of the investigation, but the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. Her trial was swift, given the overwhelming evidence and her own admission. The courtroom was somber as the prosecutor laid out the details of Mercer Holbrook's death, portraying Jenna's actions as both deliberate and calculated. Jenna's defense, however, painted a different picture: a mother pushed to her limits, acting out of desperation to protect her daughter. Character witnesses spoke of her spotless reputation, her years of service as a nurse, and her dedication to raising Astrid alone. The jury was visibly moved, but the law required accountability. Jenna was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. For Astrid, the trial was a deeply emotional ordeal. Watching her mother take responsibility for a crime committed in her defense left her torn between gratitude and guilt. Jenna's final words to Astrid before being taken into custody were a mixture of reassurance and resolve. "You're stronger than you think," she said, holding Astrid's hands tightly. "Live your life, heal, and remember, this was my choice." Astrid began therapy soon after, determined to process the trauma of the past few months. She also started treatment for her HIV diagnosis and leaned on her small circle of friends for support. Her pregnancy, which had once seemed overwhelming, became a source of hope. With her mother's guidance and a fierce will to move forward, Astrid decided to keep the baby, naming her son Michael after her late father. For Detectives Thorne and Everett, the case left a lasting impact. Thorne, in particular, found herself revisiting Jenna's words and actions, questioning the thin line between justice and morality. She visited Jenna in prison occasionally, finding their conversations surprisingly honest and reflective. "I'll never ask for forgiveness," Jenna once told her, "but I'd like to believe I did what any mother would." The story of Mercer Holbrook's death and its aftermath rippled through the university and beyond. While the North River Wolves continued their season under a new coach, the shadow of the case lingered. It was a reminder of how even the most successful lives can hide dark secrets, and how love, in its most desperate form, can lead to unthinkable choices. For Astrid and her son, it marked the beginning of a long journey toward healing and a future shaped by resilience. The case of Mercer Holbrook's death left behind a legacy that continued to spark debate long after the courtroom closed. For the public, it was a story about ambition, secrets, and the lengths a parent would go to protect their child. But for those closest to the events, it was a reminder of how fragile trust and reputation can be. At North River University, Mercer's name became a point of quiet contention. While his achievements as a coach were undeniable, the revelations about his private life left a stain that couldn't be erased. The basketball team pressed on under new leadership, but the shadow of their former coach lingered, a cautionary tale for those who held him in high regard. Astrid Payne found herself at the center of unwanted attention. Though the media eventually moved on, whispers and judgments followed her. She chose to focus on her future, determined not to let the past define her. Her journalism studies took on a new purpose as she began writing about resilience and hope, drawing from her own experiences. Detective Raven Thorne often revisited the case in her mind. She wrestled with the moral gray area Jenna Payne's actions had illuminated. In her 2 decades as a detective, few cases had left her questioning the intersection of law and justice as much as this one. Her visits to Jenna in prison were infrequent but meaningful, filled with quiet reflections on choices, consequences, and the burdens people carry. Jenna, meanwhile, adjusted to life behind bars with the same resilience that had defined her as a nurse and a mother. Her letters to Astrid were filled with encouragement and advice, urging her daughter to move forward without dwelling on the past. In her own way, Jenna found a sense of peace, knowing her actions had protected Astrid, even at great personal cost. The pier where Merce's car was found remained a quiet, unremarkable spot. Fishermen came and went, unaware of the drama that had unfolded there. For those who knew the story, it stood as a haunting reminder of the choices people make in moments of desperation. Life moved on, but the echoes of the case remained, shaping the lives of those who lived through it and leaving behind lessons about the complexity of human relationships and the price of secrets.